The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Maria Alvarez adjusted the collar of her blazer and took a deep breath. She glanced around, noticing the sea of faces staring back at her, lawyers scribbling notes, reporters clicking away on their phones, and members of the public craning their necks to catch a glimpse of what was unfolding. The air felt heavy, charged with tension, like the calm before a storm. Today, she wasn't just a journalist. She was a witness in a case that had gripped the small town for months. Maria had made a name for herself as someone who didn't shy away from tough stories. Her articles exposed corruption, held people accountable, and often stirred up controversy. But this time, it was personal. She'd spent weeks investigating allegations of misconduct within the police department, uncovering patterns of negligence and abuse of power, and now here she was standing in front of everyone ready to testify against Detective Ryan Cole, a man whose name had become synonymous with indifference in her mind. As she settled into the witness chair, her eyes locked onto Ryan. He sat quietly at the defense table, his expression unreadable. To Maria, he looked like just another face in the crowd, unremarkable and unimpressive. His demeanor gave nothing away, no hint of guilt or innocence, only an unsettling calmness that irked her. She couldn't help but think of all the times she'd tried reaching out to him during her investigation. Each call went unanswered, each email ignored. It was as if he didn't care, or worse, as if he thought he was untouchable. When the prosecutor asked Maria to recount her interactions with Ryan, her voice carried a sharp edge. "Detective Cole," she began, leaning slightly forward, "was absent when we needed answers. He dismissed concerns raised by whistleblowers without even looking into them. In my opinion, he represents everything wrong with law enforcement. Today," her words hung in the air, deliberate and cutting. She described how she'd approached him multiple times, hoping to shed light on issues plaguing the department. Instead of cooperation, she encountered silence, a deafening refusal to engage. "It's almost like he doesn't exist," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "He's a nobody." The courtroom murmured at her choice of words. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Across the room, Ryan remained still, his gaze fixed ahead. If Maria's scathing remarks affected him, he didn't show it. But those seated near him noticed subtle shifts, a slight tightening of his jaw, a brief flicker in his otherwise stoic expression. These tiny reactions were fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet they hinted at something beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Maria continued laying out her case. She recounted specific instances where Ryan's inaction seemed suspicious. There was the whistleblower who claimed harassment after reporting misconduct, only to be met with bureaucratic red tape. Then there was the internal review process that dragged on endlessly, producing no tangible results. Every example painted Ryan as part of a system designed to protect itself rather than serve justice. But as Maria spoke, a nagging thought crept into her mind. Why hadn't Ryan defended himself? Why hadn't he pushed back against her accusations? Most people in his position would have been eager to clear their name, to prove they weren't complicit. Yet Ryan stayed silent, letting her words wash over him without protest. Was it arrogance? Indifference? Or was there more to the story than she realized? Unbeknownst to Maria, Ryan's silence wasn't born out of apathy. For years, he'd worked tirelessly behind the scenes, navigating the treacherous waters of internal affairs, IA. As the head of IA, his role was anything but insignificant. He dealt with cases that others avoided, confronting uncomfortable truths and making enemies along the way. His job required discretion, patience, and an ability to see beyond appearances, qualities that often left him misunderstood. To most outsiders, internal affairs operated like a shadow organization, rarely seen but always suspected of ulterior motives. Officers viewed IA investigators with suspicion, accusing them of betrayal whenever misconduct allegations surfaced. Civilians, on the other hand, expected immediate action, unaware of the painstaking process involved in gathering evidence and building cases. Caught between these two worlds, Ryan had learned to keep his head down and let his work speak for itself. Yet here he was, sitting in a courtroom, being called a nobody by someone who knew nothing about him. The irony wasn't lost on him. Still, he chose not to interrupt Maria's testimony. Experience had taught him that explanations rarely swayed opinions in moments like this. People saw what they wanted to see, and Maria clearly saw him as part of the problem. As the morning wore on, the weight of Maria's words began to settle over the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, already crafting headlines based on her dramatic portrayal of Ryan. Spectators whispered among themselves, forming judgments based on snippets of information. Through it all, Ryan remained composed, his posture unwavering. Only those closest to him could detect the faintest trace of sadness in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of how easily perceptions could overshadow reality. For Maria, the day marked a victory of sorts. She'd laid bare her frustrations, exposing what she believed to be systemic failures within the department. But deep down, a seed of doubt began to take root. Something about Ryan's demeanor, the quiet strength, the absence of defensiveness, didn't align with her image of a lazy, indifferent bureaucrat. Perhaps there was more to the man she'd labeled a nobody than met the eye. Little did she know, that realization would set the stage for a journey neither of them anticipated. The courtroom was quieter now, the initial buzz of Maria's testimony giving way to a more subdued atmosphere. The prosecutor had finished his line of questioning, and it was time for the defense attorney to step in. Maria shifted uncomfortably, in her seat as the lawyer approached her with a calm but deliberate stride. His presence exuded confidence, and she couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. This was the part she dreaded, the cross-examination. Ms. Alvarez, the defense attorney began, his voice smooth and measured. You've described my client, Detective Ryan Cole, as someone who is absent, unresponsive, and indifferent. Is that correct? Maria nodded firmly. Yes, that's accurate. The lawyer paused, glancing down at his notes before looking up again. And you've referred to him as… What did you call him? A nobody? Her cheeks flushed slightly at the repetition of her own words, but she didn't back down. I believe that term accurately reflects his level of involvement, or lack thereof, in addressing serious issues within the department. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Maria could feel dozens of eyes on her. She straightened, her posture, determined not to let the pressure get to her. But then the lawyer leaned forward, his tone shifting ever so slightly. Ms. Alvarez, have you ever heard of internal affairs? He asked. She frowned, caught off guard by the seemingly unrelated question. Of course I have. It's the division responsible for investigating misconduct within law enforcement agencies. The lawyer nodded slowly, his expression neutral. Correct. And would you agree that internal affairs plays a critical role in maintaining accountability and integrity within the police force? Maria hesitated for a moment, unsure where this line of questioning was heading. Yes, I suppose so. The lawyer smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. Suppose? Or do you know for certain? I know they're supposed to investigate complaints against officers, she replied cautiously. But in practice, their effectiveness often leaves much to be desired. The lawyer tilted his head, considering her response. Interesting. Now, Ms. Alvarez, let me ask you this. Did you know that Detective Ryan Cole isn't just any detective? In fact, he leads the Internal Affairs Division for this entire department? For a split second, Maria thought she hadn't heard him correctly. Her mind raced, trying to process the implications of what he'd just said. Ryan Cole, the man she'd dismissed as apathetic, lazy, even complicit, was the head of Internal Affairs? The very division tasked with rooting out corruption and holding officers accountable? The courtroom fell silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy and suffocating. All eyes turned toward Ryan, who remained seated, his expression unchanged. He didn't look smug or triumphant. Instead, he appeared almost resigned, as if he'd expected this moment all along. Maria, on the other hand, felt her face grow hot, with embarrassment. How could she have gotten it so wrong? How could she have failed to see the bigger picture? The defense attorney seized the opportunity. Ms. Alvarez, does this new information change your perception of Detective Cole's Role in the department. She opened her mouth to respond but found herself at a loss for words. Her earlier accusations suddenly seemed hollow, based on assumptions rather than facts. She glanced at Ryan again, searching for some sign of emotion, anger, amusement, anything. But his demeanor remained inscrutable. Finally, she managed to stammer out a reply. I wasn't aware of his position. If I had known, perhaps my characterization would have been different. The lawyer nodded, satisfied. Thank you, Ms. Alvarez. No further questions? As the judge called for a recess, Maria sat frozen, in her chair, her mind reeling. She replayed the events of the past few weeks in her head, the ignored emails, the unanswered calls, the dismissive attitude she'd attributed to Ryan. What if none of those things were signs of indifference? What if they were simply the result of a man overwhelmed by the weight of his responsibilities? When the session resumed, Maria barely paid attention to the proceedings. Instead, she found herself stealing glances at Ryan, studying him in a way she hadn't before. There was something about his quiet composure that intrigued her. Was it possible that beneath the stoic exterior lay a man deeply committed to doing the right thing, even when it meant facing hostility from every direction? After the day's hearing concluded, Maria lingered outside the courthouse, watching as people filed out. She spotted Ryan walking briskly toward the parking lot, his shoulders squared, his steps purposeful. Before she could talk herself out of it, she called out to him. "Detective Cole." Her voice echoed across the courtyard, drawing curious stares from passers-by. Ryan stopped mid-stride and turned to face her. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Maria felt a pang of guilt. She approached him hesitantly, unsure of how to begin. I wanted to apologize," she said, her tone softer than usual. "I didn't realize who you are or what you do. My statements in court were based on incomplete information, and I regret painting such an unfair picture of you." Ryan studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he gave a small nod. "It's okay," he said simply. "You weren't the first person to misunderstand my role, and you won't be the last." His response disarmed her. She had expected defensiveness, maybe even anger, but instead, he seemed almost resigned to being misunderstood. It made her wonder how many times he'd faced similar situations, how many people had judged him without knowing the full story. "Can I ask you something?" she ventured cautiously. He shrugged. "Go ahead. What exactly does leading internal affairs entail? From the outside, it seems like nothing really gets done." Ryan sighed, glancing around as if weighing whether to engage. Finally, he gestured toward a nearby bench. "Let's sit," he said. As they settled onto the bench, Ryan began to explain. He spoke quietly, his words measured and thoughtful. He described the delicate balancing act required to maintain trust within the department while holding officers accountable. He talked about the long hours spent reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and navigating political pressures. Most of all, he emphasized the isolation that came with the job, the constant suspicion from colleagues, the mistrust from the public, the feeling of being caught between two worlds. Maria listened intently, her preconceived notions crumbling with each sentence. She realized now why Ryan had seemed so distant during her investigation. It wasn't because he didn't care. It was because he couldn't afford to let emotions cloud his judgment. Every decision he made carried enormous weight, affecting not only individual lives but also the integrity of the entire department. By the time they parted ways, Maria's perspective had shifted entirely. The man she'd once dismissed as a nobody was anything but. He was a figure operating in the shadows, fighting battles most people never saw. And though she still had questions about the system, about accountability, about justice itself, she couldn't deny that Ryan Cole deserved far more credit than she'd given him. As she walked away, Maria resolved to dig deeper, to uncover the truth behind the enigma that was internal affairs. Little did she know this revelation would set her on a path that would challenge everything she thought she knew. Not just about Ryan, but about the complexities of seeking justice in a flawed world. That night, Maria sat at her cluttered desk in the dim glow of her laptop screen. The conversation with Ryan replayed in her mind like a loop she couldn't escape. His calm demeanor, his measured words, they contradicted everything she'd assumed about him. She felt a mix of emotions swirling inside: guilt for misjudging him, curiosity about his work, and frustration with herself for not digging deeper before speaking out. She opened a blank document on her computer and typed 2 words at the top: Ryan Cole. Beneath it, she began jotting down notes from their brief exchange outside the courthouse. Words like internal affairs, isolation, accountability, and trust stood out to her. But these phrases only scratched the surface. If Ryan truly led IA, then why did the public know so little about what they actually did? Why did officers treat them with such disdain? And most importantly, was he really as committed to justice as he claimed? Determined to find answers, Maria dove into research. She started by combing through old news articles, looking for any mention of Ryan or high-profile cases handled by Internal Affairs. At first, the search yielded frustratingly little. Most reports glossed over IA's involvement, focusing instead on arrests or disciplinary actions without crediting the division behind the scenes. It was as if Internal Affairs operated under an unspoken code of invisibility. But then, buried deep in online archives, she stumbled upon something intriguing: a series of exposés written years ago by another investigative journalist. The pieces detailed how IA had quietly dismantled a network of corrupt officers involved in drug trafficking and bribery. According to the articles, the investigation had taken months, maybe even years, of painstaking work. Officers were surveilled, evidence gathered meticulously, and alliances tested repeatedly. When the case finally broke, the department underwent sweeping changes, but nowhere in the headlines was Internal Affairs credited. Their role remained anonymous, overshadowed by the scandal itself. Maria leaned back in her chair, her pulse quickening. Could Ryan have been part of that operation? Was this the kind of work he did every day, stepping into the shadows to root out corruption while others took the credit? Her skepticism wavered slightly, replaced by a growing sense of intrigue. For the first time, she considered the possibility that Ryan wasn't just another cog in the machine. Maybe he was trying to fix it. Her next step was reaching out to sources who might provide more insight. Over the years, Maria had built a network of contacts within law enforcement, ranging from street cops to retired detectives. Some trusted her. Others tolerated her presence because they knew she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. One name in particular came to mind: Officer Greg Morales, a veteran cop who had recently retired after nearly 3 decades on the force. Greg agreed to meet her at a quiet cafe downtown. When Maria arrived, he was already seated at a corner table, nursing a cup of coffee. His grizzled features softened when he saw her, though his eyes remained sharp and wary. "Maria," he greeted her with a nod. "What brings you here?" She slid into the seat across from him and wasted no time getting to the point. "I need your take on Internal Affairs," she said bluntly. "Specifically, Ryan Cole." Greg raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Ryan? What's he got to do with anything?" "He's at the center of a case I'm covering," she replied evasively. "And I want to understand his reputation better." Greg hesitated, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "Look, Maria, IA's a tricky subject. People either hate him or fear him. Cops think they're snitches, civilians think they don't do enough. Truth is, they walk a fine line." "And where does Ryan fit into all that?" she pressed. Greg sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Ryan's different. He doesn't play politics like some of the higher-ups. When he takes on a case, he sees it through to the end, no matter how messy it gets. But that makes him enemies. A lot of guys resent him because he won't look the other way, even if it means going after one of their own." Maria scribbled notes furiously, her pen flying across the page. "Has he ever faced backlash for it?" "More times than I can count," Greg admitted. "There've been threats, rumors spread about him, even attempts to discredit his work. But Ryan doesn't flinch. He keeps his head down and does his job. Whether you agree with him or not, you gotta respect that. As Greg spoke, Maria felt a shift in her perspective. The image of Ryan as a detached bureaucrat faded further, replaced by someone far more complex. Here was a man willing to risk his safety and career to hold others accountable, yet condemned by those he sought to protect. It was a paradox that left her unsettled and increasingly curious. Later that evening, Maria decided to dig deeper into Ryan's personal history. She accessed public records, social media profiles, and old interviews, piecing together fragments of his life outside the badge. What she found painted a picture of resilience and sacrifice. Ryan had grown up in a working-class neighborhood, the son of a single mother who worked double shifts to make ends meet. He joined the police academy straight out of college, driven by a desire to create change in communities like his own. Early in his career, he earned a reputation for fairness and integrity, traits that eventually caught the attention of internal affairs recruiters. But success came at a cost. Ryan's marriage dissolved during his early years in IA, reportedly due to the strain of his demanding job. Friends described him as fiercely private, rarely discussing his work even with loved ones. Neighbors recalled seeing him leave home late at night or return early in the morning, always dressed in plain clothes, always carrying the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. By the time Maria closed her laptop, exhaustion had set in. Yet her mind refused to rest. Every new detail about Ryan challenged her initial assumptions, forcing her to confront uncomfortable truths. Was she guilty of the same biases she criticized in others? Had she judged him too harshly simply because he didn't fit her narrative of a crusader for justice? The next morning, Maria woke with a renewed sense of purpose. She realized that understanding Ryan required more than reading articles or talking to sources. It demanded direct engagement. She needed to see his world firsthand, to witness the complexities of his role rather than relying on second-hand accounts. Making up her mind, she drafted a carefully worded email to Ryan, proposing an off-the-record meeting. To her surprise, he responded within hours, agreeing to meet her at a diner on the outskirts of town. When Maria arrived, Ryan was already seated in a booth near the window, sipping black coffee. He looked up as she approached, his expression guarded but polite. "Thanks for coming," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Figured you'd have more questions," he replied dryly. "You strike me as someone who doesn't give up easily." She smiled faintly, appreciating his candor. "You're right, I don't, and I owe you an apology for jumping to conclusions without knowing the full story." Ryan shrugged, dismissing her apology with a wave of his hand. "It happens. People see what they expect to see. I stopped taking it personally a long time ago." His nonchalance disarmed her, making her feel both guilty and grateful. "Still, I want to understand," she said earnestly. "Not just your role in IA, but the bigger picture. How does it all work? Why does it seem so invisible to the public?" Ryan leaned back in the booth, considering her question. "IA's a balancing act," he explained. "We investigate complaints against officers, gather evidence, recommend actions, but we're also part of the department, which means we have to maintain trust with the people we oversee. That tension creates friction from both sides." "What about transparency?" Maria asked. "Why isn't the public told more about your work?" "Because transparency can compromise investigations," he said simply. "If we announce every move we make, it gives suspects time to cover their tracks. Plus, not every case leads to disciplinary action. Sometimes allegations turn out to be unfounded. You telling the world we're investigating someone could ruin their reputation for nothing." Maria nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "So you operate in silence to protect the process?" "Exactly. But silence has its downsides. People assume we're doing nothing, or worse, that we're covering things up." Their conversation continued for over an hour, touching on everything from specific cases to broader systemic issues. With each passing minute, Maria grew more convinced that Ryan was exactly who he claimed to be. A man dedicated to rooting out corruption, even if it meant sacrificing recognition. Yet doubts lingered at the edges of her mind. Was his commitment genuine, or was he manipulating the system for personal gain? Only time and further investigation would reveal the truth. As they parted ways, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the brink of something significant. Understanding Ryan Cole wasn't just about uncovering the truth about one man. It was about confronting the gray areas of justice itself. And as daunting as that prospect seemed, she knew she couldn't turn away now. The diner on the outskirts of town was quiet, its fluorescent lights casting a soft glow over the worn Formica tables. Maria sat across from Ryan, her notepad open but untouched, her pen hovering hesitantly above the page. For once, she wasn't in journalist mode, at least not entirely. This meeting wasn't about gathering sound bites or crafting headlines. It was about understanding the man behind the badge. And yet, every word Ryan spoke seemed to deepen the mystery surrounding him. "You said earlier that IA operates in silence," Maria began, breaking the lull in their conversation. "But doesn't that make you feel, I don't know, invisible? Like no one sees the work you're doing?" Ryan took a sip of his coffee, his eyes fixed on the chipped rim of the mug. "It's not about being seen," he replied after a moment. "It's about getting results. If people notice us, it usually means we've messed up somewhere." Maria frowned, leaning forward slightly. "But isn't there value in transparency? In showing the public that someone is actually holding officers accountable?" Ryan set the mug down and met her gaze. His expression was calm, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made her sit up straighter. "Transparency has its place, sure. But think about it. If we announce every investigation, every accusation, what happens? Officers clam up. Suspects destroy evidence. Witnesses change their stories. The system breaks down before we even get started." He paused as if weighing how much more to share. "And then there's the flip side. What if we investigate someone and find they're innocent? Their reputation's already ruined. Lives are damaged for nothing. That's why we keep things quiet. Until we're certain." Maria nodded slowly, absorbing his explanation. It made sense in theory, but something about it still felt unsettling. "So you're saying invisibility is necessary for the job, but doesn't that isolation take a toll on you? On your team?" Ryan chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "Chung." Maria's questions hung in the air between them, heavy and probing. Ryan leaned back in his seat, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee mug. For a moment he seemed lost in thought, as if weighing how much of himself he was willing to reveal. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Isolation comes with the territory," he admitted. "You can't do this job without making enemies. Cops don't trust you because they think you're out to get them. Civilians don't trust you because they assume you're protecting your own. And honestly," he paused, glancing out the window at the empty parking lot, "sometimes I don't even trust myself." Maria tilted her head, intrigued by the vulnerability in his tone. "What do you mean?" Ryan sighed, running a hand over his face. "This job forces you to make impossible decisions. You investigate someone, a colleague, maybe even a friend, and you find evidence that proves they've crossed the line. Do you turn them in? Of course you do. That's the job. But it doesn't make it any easier. Every time you expose corruption, you lose a piece of yourself. Eventually you start wondering, am I becoming the thing I'm trying to fight?" His words struck a chord with Maria. She had always prided herself on her ability to remain objective, to separate her emotions from her work. But listening to Ryan, she realized how isolating that mindset could be. It wasn't just about holding others accountable. It was about carrying the weight of those choices alone. "And yet," Ryan continued, his voice steadying, "you keep going. Because if you don't, who will? The system isn't perfect, but it's all we've got. Someone has to stand up for what's right even when no one's watching." Maria scribbled a few notes on her pad, though her mind was racing too fast to focus. "Do you ever wish you could walk away?" she asked. "Start over somewhere else?" Ryan gave a small, rueful smile. "Every day. But where would I go? This job isn't just what I do. It's who I am. I didn't choose IA. It chose me. And once you see the things I've seen, you can't unsee them. Ignoring the problem doesn't make it go away. Their conversation shifted then, moving from abstract ideas to specific cases. Ryan shared stories of investigations that had shaped him, some triumphant, others devastating. There was the rookie officer caught planting evidence to close a high-profile case, whose career ended in disgrace. There was the veteran detective accused of taking bribes, whose guilt nearly tore apart an entire precinct. Each story carried its own moral ambiguity, leaving Maria grappling with the complexity of justice. As the hours passed, their dynamic began to shift. What started as an interview felt more like a partnership now. Maria found herself asking fewer, pointed questions and instead offering observations, sharing her own frustrations with the system. Ryan listened intently, nodding occasionally as if relieved to finally have someone who understood the weight of his world. You know, Maria said after a long pause, I used to think the problem was black and white. Corruption exists, so weed it out. Simple, right? But talking to you, it's clear there's so much gray. Ryan nodded. Gray is where most of us live. The challenge is finding a way to navigate it without losing sight of your principles. Over the next few weeks, Maria and Ryan continued meeting regularly, at diners, coffee shops, or sometimes just in quiet corners of public parks. Their conversations grew less formal, more collaborative. Maria brought fresh insights from her, reporting while Ryan offered behind-the-scenes perspectives that illuminated the inner workings of internal affairs. Together, they pieced together a narrative that neither could have uncovered alone. But as their professional relationship deepened, personal boundaries began to blur. Maria noticed subtle changes in Ryan, how he smiled more often now, how his guard seemed to drop whenever they were together. Similarly, Ryan found himself opening up in ways he hadn't anticipated, revealing parts of himself he'd kept hidden for years. One evening, as they walked through the park under the fading light of dusk, Maria broached a subject that had been nagging at her. I've been thinking, she said hesitantly. If IA does so much good, why does it seem like nothing ever changes? Why are we still dealing with the same issues year after year? Ryan stopped walking and turned to face her. His expression was grim, but resolute. Because corruption isn't just a few bad apples. It's systemic, it's embedded in policies, practices, culture. Taking down one corrupt officer doesn't fix the root cause. That's why my work feels like bailing water out of a sinking ship sometimes. But what if we expose the bigger picture? Maria pressed. Not just individual cases, but the patterns, the connections, the systemic failures. Wouldn't that force real change? Ryan hesitated, his brow furrowing. It could. Or it could blow up in our faces. Exposing too much too soon risks alienating everyone. The department, the public, even the people we're trying to protect. Maria crossed her arms, her determination unwavering. Maybe. But isn't it worth the risk? Isn't that why you do what you do? To make things better? Ryan stared at her for a long moment, his gaze searching hers. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, let's do it. But we need to be smart about this. If we're going to shine a light on the truth, we have to make sure it doesn't burn everything down in the process. As they finalized their plan over the following days, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into uncharted territory. Her instincts told her this story had the potential to be groundbreaking, but also dangerous. She knew they weren't just challenging corruption, they were challenging power itself, and power rarely relinquished control without a fight. Meanwhile, Ryan wrestled with his own doubts. Sharing classified information with a journalist, even one as principled as Maria, was risky. If discovered, it could cost him his career, his reputation, possibly even his safety. Yet something about Maria's conviction resonated with him. Maybe it was her refusal to settle for half-truths, or maybe it was the way she made him believe that change was possible, even in a broken system. Their collaboration reached a tipping point when Maria stumbled upon a lead that neither of them had anticipated. While reviewing files Ryan had discreetly shared with her, she uncovered evidence pointing to a massive cover-up involving not just rogue officers, but also higher-ranking officials, including individuals close to Ryan. The implications were staggering, threatening to implicate some of the most powerful figures in the department. When she showed Ryan the documents, his reaction was immediate and visceral. This changes everything," he muttered, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. "If this gets out, it won't just be careers destroyed, it'll be lives ruined." Maria placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "I know. It's risky. But isn't this exactly why we're doing this? To hold everyone accountable no matter how high up the ladder they are?" Ryan looked at her, his eyes filled with conflict. For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. Then, with a deep breath, he nodded. "Okay. Let's finish what we started. But we need to be careful. One wrong move and this whole thing could collapse." As they left the cafe that night, both knew they were crossing a point of no return. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, dangers, and sacrifices. But for the first time, neither felt alone in the fight. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Not as adversaries, but as allies united by a shared belief in justice. And perhaps, Maria thought as she watched Ryan disappear into the night, that belief was enough to spark real change. The day Maria's expose hit the front page of the city's largest newspaper, the world seemed to stop. The headline blared in bold letters. "Unveiling the Shadows. Corruption within the police department exposed." Beneath it was a meticulously researched article that laid bare decades of systemic misconduct, detailing everything from bribery and evidence tampering to cover-ups orchestrated by high-ranking officials. The piece didn't just name names, it connected dots, revealing patterns of abuse that stretched across generations. Ryan sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the article on his laptop screen. His hands rested lightly on the keyboard, though he hadn't typed a word in hours. He knew this moment would come, had prepared for it in theory. But now that it was here, he felt the weight of its reality pressing down on him. The article spared his name, framing him as a silent guardian working tirelessly behind the scenes to expose the truth. Yet Ryan knew better than anyone that protecting his identity wouldn't shield him completely. As the hours passed, his phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages. Some were from colleagues offering cautious support, others were thinly veiled threats. One text stood out, a single line from an unknown number. "You'll regret this." Ryan deleted it without responding, his jaw tightening. He'd expected backlash, but seeing it materialize was still jarring. Meanwhile, Maria watched the public reaction unfold with a mix of exhilaration and dread. Social media erupted almost instantly. Hashtags like "Justice for All" and "Expose the Truth" trended nationwide. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters, holding signs demanding accountability. Reporters camped outside Maria's office, eager to interview the woman who had dared to take on one of the most powerful institutions in the city. But not all reactions were positive. Critics accused Maria of sensationalism, claiming her article lacked nuance and painted the entire department with too broad a brush. Others questioned her motives, suggesting she had ulterior reasons for targeting law enforcement. Through it all, Maria remained steadfast, fielding questions during press conferences and defending her work with unwavering conviction. Behind closed doors, however, the pressure mounted. She received anonymous emails threatening her safety, warning her to back off before it was too late. Her editor urged caution, reminding her that while the story was groundbreaking, it also made her a target. But Maria refused to back down. For every threat she received, there were 10 messages of gratitude from whistleblowers, victims of police misconduct, and ordinary citizens tired of feeling powerless. Those voices kept her going. In the weeks that followed, the fallout intensified. City officials scrambled to address the scandal, launching investigations and promising reforms. Several officers named in the article were suspended pending further review, while others resigned preemptively to avoid scrutiny. Internal affairs became a focal point of discussion, with lawmakers debating whether the division needed more resources or if it should be overhauled entirely. Amidst the chaos, Ryan faced a decision no one could have prepared him for. The chief of police called him into a private meeting, where he was presented with two options: step down quietly or face termination amidst allegations of misconduct. It wasn't hard to see through the thinly veiled ultimatum. By stepping away, Ryan could protect his family from potential retaliation while allowing the department to save face. Staying on, however, meant risking everything, including his life, for a fight that might never truly end. That night, Ryan sat at his kitchen table, staring at a blank resignation letter. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. On one hand, leaving IA felt like surrendering to the very system he'd spent years trying to reform. On the other, staying put risked dragging innocent people, his wife, his teenage daughter, into a dangerous crossfire. After hours of deliberation, he finally picked up his pen and signed the letter. As he sealed the envelope, a sense of finality washed over him, not sadness exactly, but acceptance. When Maria heard about Ryan's resignation, she felt a pang of guilt. Though his name hadn't appeared in the article, she knew his involvement couldn't remain hidden forever. She reached out to him immediately, arranging to meet at their usual diner. When she arrived, Ryan was already seated, nursing a cup of coffee. His expression was calm, though there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You didn't have to do this," Maria said softly, sliding into the booth across from him. Ryan shrugged. "Yes, I did. You can't fix a broken system from the inside when everyone sees you as part of the problem." Maria frowned, leaning forward. "But you're not the problem. You're the solution. Without you, none of this would have happened." Ryan smiled faintly, shaking his head. "It's not about me, Maria. It's about the bigger picture. If my stepping aside helps push for real change, then it's worth it." They talked for hours, discussing what came next, not just for Ryan, but for the movement they'd inadvertently sparked. Ryan admitted he planned to mentor young recruits, teaching them how to navigate the ethical gray areas of policing without losing sight of their principles. Maria, meanwhile, vowed to continue her investigative work, shining a light on injustices wherever they existed. Months later, the city began implementing sweeping reforms. Oversight committees were established, transparency measures introduced, and funding allocated to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the community. While progress was slow, the momentum continued to build. Maria's article became required. Reading in journalism schools, hailed as a landmark piece of investigative reporting, and though Ryan faded from the public eye, his influence lingered in the stories of those he mentored, officers committed to integrity and accountability. For Maria, the experience changed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She learned that justice wasn't black and white, it was messy, complicated, and often imperfect, but she also discovered that even in the darkest corners of society, there were people willing to stand up and fight for what was right. People like Ryan Cole. As for Ryan, he found peace in stepping back, no longer burdened by the secrecy and isolation of his role. He embraced a quieter life, content knowing he'd played a part in sparking change. He often thought about Maria, the fiery journalist who had once called him a nobody, but ended up becoming one of his greatest allies. Their partnership may have started as unlikely, but it proved that understanding and collaboration could transcend differences. In the end, neither Maria nor Ryan emerged unscathed. They carried scars, emotional, professional, personal, but they also carried hope. Hope that exposing the truth, no matter how painful, could pave the way for something better. Hope that even in a flawed world, redemption and resolution were possible, and hope that together they had taken a step toward making justice mean something more than just a word.